in science, and today is biology. We have a special guest, Daniel Mosquin from the UVC Botanical Garden. And as you probably guessed, he's a botanist. Now, Daniel is a research manager at the garden. He also teaches classes in horticulture, and he likes to go botanizing in beautiful places. He started his position at the garden in 2000 after receiving his bachelor's degree of science from the University of Manitoba. He's passionate about plants, and he's an amazing photographer. Daniel will talk about his career path and how he has been able to incorporate his personal interest into his work responsibilities. So it is with great pleasure to introduce Daniel Mosquin.
Thank you. Thank you. How's our sound doing? All good? Good. I've been sick the past few days, but I'm feeling pretty good today, so hopefully everything will go well. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk a bit about synchronicity today, and I'm defining synchronicity as when your personal interests align with your career interests. And it's been something I've been very fortunate to have throughout my career so far, where the two have aligned very nicely. As G mentioned, I've been at the Botanical Garden at UVC for 13 years now. I've gone through a number of job titles. I'm going to talk about those as I talk about my career progression at the garden. But first of all, I'm going to talk about where I work, what my workplace does, how I came to work there. And then I'm going to touch on career opportunities in such workplaces, public institutions like botanical gardens or the BD Biodiversity Museum or similar places like that that hire biologists. I'm going to talk about the plants and the photographs from time to time, just as little asides. So there is where I work on Point Grey. I'm sure most of you are familiar with where UVC is. The Botanical Garden is right near this, it's kind of this little stretch of green right here, right beside the stadium. Here's an aerial photograph of the Botanical Garden, circa 2003. My office is right here, and I get to look over a pond and the forest nearby. This is 10 years out of date. There's been a lot of development at the Botanical Garden since then. You can see that parts of the Botanical Garden were carved out of second growth forest. This is traditional lands of the Mosquin First Nation that we're situated on. Pre-1910, much of the original forest was cut down, but you can still see a lot of the remnants of that old growth forest, especially in the Asian garden with large stumps and being used as nurse logs. Just a little bit of a tour of the Botanical Garden here. We have several components. I'm going to just give you an overview of the Botanical Garden in terms of what's there, and then kind of define a botanical garden for you because that's relevant to my career. So the David C. Lamb Asian Garden primarily contains plants from Asia, Japan, China, India, Tibet. The Alpine Garden contains plants from alpine or montane or mountainous regions of the world. It's divided into a number of continents. Generally, these are low-growing plants. Generally, they're kind of fussy, but also it means it gives us a place where we are able to show off color and interesting plants throughout the year. We have a food garden. This is it in wintertime. It doesn't look like much when it's covered underneath the snow, of course. And an arbor garden. The food garden is the most popular. People really relate to things that they eat and that they put into their mouths, apparently. Yeah, so the Physic Garden. Physic Garden is an ancient medicinal plants garden. So this is based off of a 16th century monastery type garden where we show plants that were believed to be medicinal at the time. Some of them do turn out to be medicinal. Some of them turn out to be had beliefs that weren't based on any scientific rigor. Some of our new gardens are Carolinian forest. Doesn't look like much right now. Carolinian forest is from the eastern forests of North America, the Carolinas, Georgia, West Virginia, those areas, and creeping into Ontario and Quebec. This gives us a chance to show plants from this very rare ecosystem in Canada, although it's common in the US, at the Botanical Garden at UVC. It's also really nice in the fall now. Things are starting to grow a bit. And we have a large native plant collections as well. Plants from British Columbia. The Garry Oak Meadow and Woodland. Garry Oak Meadows are, again, one of the 3 most rare or endangered ecosystems in Canada. 2 out of the 3 happen to be in British Columbia. This is the one that occurs in southeast Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. So we have a collection of plants from there. We try to use this area to interpret and to talk about conservation issues. Because that's an area that's also very dry, we use it as an area to talk about drought-resistant plantings in the summertime, that sort of thing. We're also responsible for a Japanese garden, Japanese cultural garden, the Naitobi Memorial Garden. It's not connected to the main garden, but it is a bit more of a display space. There isn't a lot of science that goes on there. It's more of a horticultural and display type of a garden. So what does a botanical garden do that's similar to other gardens? So you might be familiar with Van Dusen. You might be familiar with Bouchard Gardens on Vancouver Island. You might be familiar with some community gardens. So we do similar things to most of those other gardens. We educate, stuff like this, discussions today. We have some online education systems. We have lectures. We have a training program in horticulture. We promote issues surrounding sustainability and surrounding environmental issues, particularly things about the public good, climate change. We're a display space. Most gardens are display spaces. They're there for some reason to show off some kind of ornament or some kind of pleasing area. So visual inspiration, and to show off what can be grown locally. And then space. Space is kind of a bit harder to define, but more along the lines of a place to go where it's quiet, a place of respite, a place where you could just be calm. Studies have shown, scientific studies have shown that people who go to gardens feel better about themselves, they calm down. It's actually a great place to go to de-stress for exams, those sorts of things. So most gardens offer that kind of amenity. But a botanical garden is different from other gardens. If they don't have that term botanical in front, generally it means they're a display garden or an educational garden or a similar specific purpose garden. Botanical gardens kind of have the mandate to do research in addition to all of those other things. So we have research, and kind of the fundamental underlying part of that research is documentation. So at botanical gardens, we document everything. Plants have labels. We document how long a plant has been in the garden. We document where the plant came from, who gave it to us. It's kind of an inventory management sort of thing. Research examples in botanical gardens. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, about some of the things that I do. Collect. Botanical gardens typically have mandates to go and collect plants, usually from the wild, though not always, sometimes from cultivated spaces. But the idea there is that if you have a plant that's wild collected and you're growing it in the garden, it's scientifically useful, particularly if it has that documentation that links it back to where it was collected in the wild. Because then you get into things that are important to scientists like replicability, where they can actually replicate an experiment because they know all of the documentation. They can go back, or they can go back to that place in the wild and they can examine the whole population of plants, many different kinds of plants, many individuals related to it, and use that one at the botanical garden as an entryway into that sort of study. We also have a mandate to share. So botanical gardens are almost always nonprofit or public funded. That's compare that against Bouchard Gardens, which is a private garden. So we have a desire not to keep things to ourselves for any sort of commercial advantage or similar things. We publish our findings. If there's research that's been done, we publish our findings in scientific journals. We share germplasm material with other institutions, and we collaborate with other researchers and institutions. This is a fairly rare magnolia, by the way. So looking at a few different kinds of gardens in the local area and kind of dividing it into 3 spheres, research, display, and education, UVC Botanical Garden falls kind of here in my mind anyway. Some research, some education, some display. It's kind of the only one in the local area that has that collective mandate. Van Dusen has education and display. They don't have any research scientists on staff. They're not linked into any universities, and so they fall more in that education display space. Bouchard, almost strictly display. And you know that when you go to Bouchard. I mean, it's all wow. People come to the botanical garden, and because we have all of these other things that we have to do, they come and they say, where's the flowers? Well, we don't have these mass displays of flowers because we're more interested in having a wide collection and diversity of plants. So I mentioned the research component. That's part of what I help with as research manager. So now we're going to talk a bit about me. So we're going to go into the uninteresting part of this presentation. So I grew up in Manitoba, and I had parents, aunts, and uncles who would take me out to go see special things in the woods, in nature. Whenever the lady slippers were in bloom, it was a trip to go see those. When the lightning bugs were out, or the fireflies, I would go out to see those at night. Whenever the gentians were in bloom, whenever the irises were in bloom. My aunts and uncles would take me bird watching. And so they really kind of cultivated that sense, and I've thought about it a little bit the past couple months, whether I was inclined that way and they noticed that and they were fostering that, or whether they were pushing me in that direction. I still haven't really figured it out. But I started out as a bird watcher, and I still have that love, but I stopped doing that in my middle teens because I had to wear glasses, and then I didn't like using binoculars, and so I switched to plants. And so I've been doing plants now for 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years. So that's kind of where I started from. This is a showy lady slipper. Manitoba has an outstanding orchid diversity compared to BC because it has all of that large boggy area, the boreal forest. So I went to school. I started at UBC, completed my undergraduate at University of Manitoba, closer to home, for a number of reasons. Unlike high school, university wasn't always easy for me. Some classes were great. They were A's, taxonomy for one. Some were failures for me. I wasn't perfect in everything. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was struggling with mild depression, and I look back now and I realize that that's really affected my career path along the way. I wish I'd sought help sooner. If it's something that you deal with, reach out for help if you can. But as I said, there were several bright spots for me. Taxonomy was one of them. Taxonomy is, just going to briefly go into this, the classification of objects or ideas according to a set of rules. So this is a very simple taxonomic structure, and we don't have to worry too much about what's in here. Just to know that things are contained within other things. There's a hierarchy, so all oaks are related, and oaks are closely related to beeches, and then beeches and birches are fairly closely related, and so on as you go higher up the hierarchy. We're going to come back to this in just a little bit with something that may be a bit more familiar. So I completed my undergraduate in Manitoba. I headed back out west, and I arrived in Kelowna. That was to be closer to my future wife. She lived in southeast Washington state. So in retrospect, I probably should have lived in a Soyuz. Instead of 6-hour drive, it would have only been 4.5. We saw each other almost every second weekend. Anyway, so I learned while in Kelowna that being an auto parts person is very similar to working with plant taxonomy. That's going to be the next slide. This is Lewisia rediviva, by the way. Bitter root. It's found many places on the east side of the Coast Cascade Mountains, Kelowna, southeast Washington, so that's why it's here. So, a car company, Ford, contains a number of models, Ford Escape, Ford Explorer, Ford Explorer contains an item, brakes. Brakes contain things like, all my little slide-ins here are off, but the brakes contain front disc brakes, front brake pads. So there's a taxonomy to auto parts as well. And believe it or not, when I said that I was working on auto parts, when I was interviewing for my first job at the Botanical Garden, this came up, and it was actually relevant. So sometimes you don't know where these things are going to come in and where they're going to be applied, but it just so happened that auto parts was actually relevant. So I know this is about finding a career in biology, but sometimes these little detours help out. Another little detour. So after spending that year in Kelowna, we married. I couldn't move down south to live with my wife until we married. And then once I was there, I couldn't work because I didn't have a work visa. So I spent the next 16 months while I was there learning about computers and building that aspect of my skills. This was the late 1990s, so people were just really getting into websites, so I was kind of interested in that. I learned some simple programming. I learned about computer hardware. And I also spent time, and you're going to laugh again at this, but I spent time on a multiplayer online game. And I transferred those skills later on, as you'll see. Which one? Right. So this was before there were graphics. It was a text-based online game. I know, really old school. But it was like World of Warcraft, except it was just all text. Anyway, I managed to transfer that in later on too. And the way I did, because I learned about community dynamics. I learned about how people related to each other, especially in online spaces. I learned about how anonymity versus identity were sometimes in conflict in those places. I learned about online reputations. I learned about conflict, a lot of conflict and that kind of thing. And so I've taken some of those skills that I learned and I've applied them to my job. But I didn't just spend time behind the computer while I was there. I also spent a bit of time outside. I volunteered with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I still kept in touch with botany a little bit through Botanical Electronic News, which is a newsletter sent out once a month or so by someone in Vancouver Island. But he writes about local news. I mentioned that in my job interview. Again, the person who was interviewing me was impressed that I was still doing that, despite the fact that I was now 2 years away removed from my botany degree, really. So I returned to Canada in late November of 1999. In February, I had a couple of job interviews, one at the Botanical Garden and one at Revenue Canada. I was looking for a job. So even though I hadn't been doing too much botanically, I still kept up with botanical news. I'd been volunteering. The job at the Botanical Garden had to do with the inventory tracking of our plants, of the plants at the Botanical Garden's collections. Unfortunately, all of that still wasn't enough. The job was offered to someone else. And so I was hoping for that one first because I had the job offer in hand from Revenue Canada. So I had accepted that one, and then I received a call on a Friday afternoon saying that the person who the job had been offered to at the Botanical Garden had declined. So probably the biggest stroke of luck in my life. She actually works at Van Dusen Botanical Garden now. Anyway, she declined, and I had to decide over the weekend whether I was going to accept the job at the Botanical Garden because I'd already committed to the one at Revenue Canada. The Botanical Garden one only had 4-month term. Revenue Canada had 6-8 months, something like that. Much longer commute to the Botanical Garden because I was living in Langley at the time, so it was about a 2-hour commute versus going to work in Surrey at Revenue Canada. But after a long discussion with my wife on that weekend, chose the garden. And I've been there since, so it was a good choice. This is something that grows in the Botanical Garden in February, by the way. So I started out as a collections technician. That was my first job. So that's where some of that auto parts experience came in handy, because we were dealing with parts inventories. Well, botanical garden inventories are very much the same thing. And inventories are very much the same thing in all of the collection sciences, whether it's working in a museum or working in a library science field. Anything that has to do with collections, the languages are different in the different disciplines, but the principles are the same. So if you recall way back, I mentioned that something that separates botanical gardens from other gardens is documentation. So essentially that was my job at the botanical garden when I started, was documentation. Every significant plant is inventoried and tracked through its lifetime in the garden. This is a butterfly, gladiolus, by the way, gladiolus papilio. Another aspect of that job was to make labels, check scientific names. So that was part of my job, was to verify the names on the plants. My boss, Douglas Justice, who was a colleague of G's at school, right? Yes. He was mostly responsible for the identifications, but then I would also have to go into the literature, scientific literature, and review the names and see if we're accurate. It's impossible to be 100% accurate on every plant in the garden at any one time, because names change over time. Sometimes there's misidentifications. But I mean, our goal is to try to get as close to perfect as possible. This is a crucial job in the context of the botanical garden. Without this labeling, we may as well not have plants in the botanical garden, or at least plants for the purposes of research. As you can see on the lower left corner there, there's a number assigned to this plant. We call it an accession number. It's like there's a number and a code on every library book, barcode. It's very similar to a barcode, so that's part of that inventory tracking again. So if a name can't be trusted, or where a plant comes from is unknown, I mentioned the plants become essentially useless for many kinds of scientific research. Part of that process of documentation, and this was something that became a hobby of mine, or a strong interest, was photography. And so I was really, there were volunteers at the garden, Douglas Justice, they really cultivated in me photography. And so that eventually became, well, my wife would say, an obsession now. I was also fortunate, another little bit of luck, is that I entered a situation in the garden where they had no IT person. And if you remember that time I spent while I was unemployed in the States, building websites, learning a little bit of programming, becoming familiar with that kind of thing. Most places had website, early 2000, but not all of them were maintaining them themselves. In fact, the garden had outsourced its website to a volunteer. That volunteer moved away, wasn't maintaining it. Guess who got the job of bringing the garden into the 21st century? That would be the only person there who had some IT experience. Nothing of it was formal. But remember that. So again, I'm just pulling in that stuff that I learned on my own. Eventually, the tasks went beyond my job description, so I meant a promotion. And they created a new position for me, the Biodiversity Informatics and Web Manager. We're going to talk about Web Manager first, talk about Biodiversity Informatics later, because it's a little bit longer of a term. So one of the first things we did when I was web manager is we set up a web forum. We had just had too much email coming in. We had established an online presence, and then people just started emailing us questions, and I thought it was ridiculous to answer everybody individually. And so we just set this up so that people could answer each other's questions, putting those community dynamic learnings from that multiplayer online game to use, because now I was dealing with a community here. And this has been running now for over 10 years successfully. The technology has gotten beyond what we have on the website right now. So eventually, very soon, I imagine we'll have to upgrade it. But right now, it's very functional, and we have a core group of users, and it's excellent. A lot of concerns that people would be posting wrong information, and this was kind of a test case. No other university botanical garden was doing this. It's kind of a test case. People out there, if they see something wrong, they'll correct it. I don't know if you've seen that little cartoon, Come to Bed, Dear. I can't right now. Somebody on the internet is wrong. You know. So I mentioned photography. So another thing I did when I was at the Botanical Garden, this was 2005 now, was started the Botany Photo of the Day weblog. So once daily, at least for the first 1,000 days, 1,000 days in a row, a plant photograph was featured along with a written supplement to the Botany Photo of the Day weblog. The write-ups, they vary from scientific information to conservation information to gardening information to discussion about the names of the plants or the pollinators for the plants. Very wide breadth of possibilities with that weblog, and it allowed me to look back at all of the things that I'd learned about plants, and it allowed me to keep on learning about plants, because one of the best ways to learn is to teach. So I've managed to translate that that photography interest into wanting to share those photographs with people to a teaching device. And again, this fits in with the mandate of the Botanical Garden to educate. This is science communication. In fact, I talked at a science communication class at UVC a couple months ago, strictly about the Photo of the Day weblog. Because the ability to communicate science is critical these days, to have critical thinking processes, to be able to translate difficult scientific concepts to digestible forms for people. Very valuable skill, something I picked up along the way. And I mean, I know I've improved since I started, but sometimes now I go back and look what I'd written back then, and I'm like, I wrote that because it's so good. I'm like, I think I've forgotten more than I've actually learned. I also use the Botany Photo of the Day weblog as a way to teach students. The University of BC has a work-study program, so students can apply to be interns, essentially, and they get paid what I consider a reasonable wage to work a maximum of 10 hours a week someplace in the university. And the Photo of the Day, because it's so well loved, it has about 5,000 subscribers to the email list from around the world. People donate, and it's almost self-funding now. They donate enough to be able to hire a work-study student throughout the year. I should also mention that not all the photographs on Photo of the Day are mine. A lot of them come from other people around the world. So we have people from Africa donating photographs, and people from South America, Colombia, people from Australia, people from across North America and Europe. So it's really nice. It builds a sense of community that way. The biodiversity informatics part. So you may have heard of the term bioinformatics if you're looking into a biology career. So bioinformatics and biodiversity informatics are slightly different in the sense that bioinformatics often has to do with handling large data sets of typically medical or cell biological information or DNA information, whereas biodiversity informatics often deals with large data sets of names of plants or ecological categorization of plants. So there's kind of a very big, people kind of move off the biodiversity informatics off to the side a little bit, because strictly when you hear about bioinformatics, it's almost always talking about medicine or DNA work or genetic work. So this was something that was new to me, but I was allowed to learn it as part of the job because I had the skills with computers and a little bit of IT work. I was moderately successful, I think. Would have been helped by more education in this, would have been helped by a little bit more formal training. But there is value in pursuing a parallel career in IT with biology because those people tend to be very valuable. A lot of people who go from IT to work in biology don't necessarily understand the biological concepts that they're trying to, or the biological problems they're trying to resolve with the information technology solution. Whereas someone who comes from biology and then learns the IT around it understands that biology isn't, things in biology don't conform to little boxes. There's a lot of looseness to biological categorizations. You may have covered what is a species. Well, a species has some fuzzy edges for a lot of biological entities. They're not very strict sort of things. And to make an IT solution for dealing with that kind of fuzziness around those biological concepts, it helps to have that biology background first. I was planning on going back to school to learn more about biodiversity informatics, by the way, but then another little bump in the road, another little detour. For some crazy reason, I don't know why, I applied for and received a $200,000 grant from Heritage Canada to create a website about the garden's first director. This is your tax dollars going to this. I should mention that about 30% of that 200,000 was for French translation. So this took me into new territory. This is all about the garden's first director and an early Canadian botanist. I think it's an excellent website, but it put me in new territory. It opened up project management to me. It opened up managing a team of up to 10 people at once. That team included writers, editors, graphic designers, programmers, so that IT experience helped a little bit again, and archivists. And archivists, again, they deal with collections. Plant collections experience helps dealing with archivists. So that put my plans to return to school on hold, because this took up the better part of almost 2 years. And after it was done, I didn't want to see it again for quite some time. But I learned a lot about project management and archives management. There's, the whole goal of this was to tell the story about John Davidson, but also to take the physical archives that existed about this man. And there were about 6,000 to 6,000 documents, slides, scans of his presentations, photographs, and did I say photographs? Slides. Anyway, and scan all of those in and make them available as a digital archive in one place, because the holdings were at UVC archives, at City of Vancouver archives, at the Botanical Garden. So to bring it all into one place in one central website. So that was another part of my job as the web manager. And now we go into the research manager aspect. I'm going to skip my little part of time when I was an education and technology manager job title, because it really is just a transitional between the two. Anybody working at the Botanical Garden has educational responsibilities. For a time, I did a lot of those. I spent a lot of time developing public lectures, and I still do that to this day and today. But as to what I do nowadays, personally the research manager. I don't do publishable research myself, at least not in terms of the upper level scientific publications, maybe more casual ones. But I do get involved with research projects, both in my personal life and in my professional life. So here are some of the things that I'm currently working on. Pictured here is a team of, there's some students, there's some staff members, and a researcher from UBC, and we've just completed a collections foray into the interior of British Columbia. So we've collected a number of herbarium specimens, and the fellow right here, there we go, that fellow, he's our curator of North American gardens at UBC. He's collected some plant specimens for the Botanical Garden. So if you don't know what a herbarium is a collection of preserved plants. And in the case of UBC's herbarium, it's part of the Biodiversity Museum. Here there's somebody who's pressing a plant. It's going to go in between those sheets of newspaper. It's going to be dried. It's going to be frozen so that no insects are introduced into the larger collection later on. And then it's going to be mounted on paper, and there's going to be a label attached to it. That label contains a large set of stored information about the plant. Who collected it, when, where. The plant is usually collected when it's fruiting or flowering. And that gives us some phenology information about that plant. And so this is something else that we've been helping out a little bit in terms of the province, in terms of tracking where things are in the province. And I suppose there's a little bit of a relationship there to climate change. If you have a large collection of plants, particularly from the same species, from the same area over a long period of time, you can see whether they're flowering 2 weeks earlier in 2010s as compared to the 1930s, for example. You can only have that information if you've been recording it on a piece of paper, or you can generate that information based off of herbarium collections. So that's one example of where herbarium collections are valuable. I also help collect DNA for research projects at the Botanical Garden and at the university itself. This is for a grad student at UBC who's doing research on the flora or the plants of southern British Columbia. Everything below 53 degrees north she wants to collect DNA from. And then she wants to process that DNA, use taxonomic methods to help determine and confirm the relationships, because there's still some mysteries. There's actually a lot of mysteries in BC. Talk about a little bit about that right away. Another part of my job, this leads a little bit more to the personal side than the professional side, although the two blend, is to help find new plants for the garden's collections. So this is from an area in southwest Oregon where there's a lot of rare and interesting plants. Partly has to do with the soil that's there, partly has to do with the fact that it was never glaciated. So we have gaps in our collection. Sometimes we have gaps of groups of plants that we want to have a full set for, because if you have the full set, sometimes that's important to research, like all of the snake bark maples, for example. Here we have a rhododendron, and we have a lot of rhododendrons at the Botanical Garden. Probably if you pointed to any shrub and you said rhododendron, you'd be right about 70% of the time. But this is a rhododendron from North America. It's very fragrant, very sweetly spicy scented. And you can see there's three different forms here. This is the one in the back, once this works. This is kind of how it looks like regularly. This one in front has more flowers than the regular one, the normal one, and they're very white. And then this one in the back here has more flowers than the regular one and very pink. So I think that this one and this one have potential in horticulture to be introduced as potentially a new plant for the trade. So I went back to collect seed in October of these plants. So I had to kind of mark them with GPS, and I had to know the location. I had to know which plants, because when you get back there and they're not in flower, they all kind of look the same. I went back to collect seed, and now we are growing this at the Botanical Garden. We're going to share some of that seed with the Coast Botanical Garden in Sunshine Coast Botanical Garden. And we'll see, maybe there's something there that comes out that's interesting in terms of horticulture. At the same time, I've wild collected that seed, and so it's got some value to researchers who might be interested in rhododendron genetics, for example. We also have some interesting research projects that come on in the garden. I don't have a photo of a particular research project that I want to share with you, but it's a good substitute for it. So there is we have a visiting researcher from Chiba University who came to the garden a couple of years ago, and he is a landscape architect, and his research had to do with how people born in Japan, how they saw plants that were pruned in certain ways versus how people in North America saw plants. So everybody wore these goggles, these eye-tracking goggles, and they were introduced to a plant, and then he would record their eye movement across the plant to see how, basically how people growing up in different cultures saw these plants that were pruned in Japanese styles. It has to do with visual aesthetics. It has to do with what is most pleasing. He asked questions about both of those things. His English wasn't very good, so I had to help out prepare the Behavioral Research Review Ethics Board application. So there's this huge amount of paperwork whenever you're doing work with human subjects. Often that doesn't happen for botanists, but I had to learn how to do that process for him and help him set up the research program. Another example of research at the Botanical Garden right now that I'm helping with, we have a visiting researcher from the University of Durham in the UK. And he is studying, he's a surface chemist. So he's a chemistry professor. And he studies the properties of water on surfaces. So something like your cell phone, you know that glossy feel on the touch screen on your cell phone? The oils don't really stick and the water doesn't stick to it. That's the kind of stuff that he does. In fact, he's got one of those patents, and I think he's very wealthy, actually. Because I'm pretty sure one of his patents is one of the ones that's being used by Nokia, and I know for sure 3M. Anyway, right now he's studying how water droplets are affected, or how they sit on plants, both how they are retained by plants and how they are wicked off by plants. And he wants to apply that surface chemistry of water properties on plant form and plant substrates. So for example, waxes on plants and those kinds of things. He wants to use that and apply the research that he's doing there at the Botanical Garden to developing kind of synthetic plants for use in arid deserts where there's really not much fresh water, but there is fog. And he wants to use it as a fog capture device. And so you need to be able to capture the fog quickly, but then you also need to be able to wick it very quickly so that it's stored and retained before it evaporates. And he wants to do that in places in the world where the water is in short supply. So he's really applying that research that he's doing at the Botanical Garden with that eventual goal. As I mentioned, the guy's a genius dealing with the cell phone surfaces and that kind of thing. I think he's onto something with this. The discovery of new species in British Columbia is something I work with. This is something that the Botanical Garden has traditionally done. This is a small little plant, doesn't look like much here. There's 5 known locations for it in the province, different from other ones known in the province. Has a close relative in Southeast Oregon, or looks very similar to one in Southeast Oregon. So I've been involved in documenting this, and I don't have the, I suppose the botanical skills yet to be able to publish a paper and say that this is a new species. But what I am doing is I'm documenting it, pulling all the information together, and generating interest from somebody who does have that ability. And so this is kind of a personal and professional thing together here. And there's actually several other species in the province which I think might be new, or not new to British Columbia anyway. Building research collaborations is another part of what we do at the Botanical Garden. So part of my job as a research manager is to talk with groups like Native Plant Society of BC or the Pink Mountain Research Project, where they're trying to conserve rare plants in northeast BC, or the South Coast Conservation Program, where they're trying to do things not necessarily related to plants, but maybe preserving some of the spotted frog, I believe, Oregon spotted frog, as well as government. So, careers in botanical gardens, and at botanical gardens you can actually also add places like museums. You can add even some of the larger parks that use some science and biology. There's kind of three approaches, maybe another one as well. Science is one entryway. So with biology, you can become a researcher, mostly botanists. You can become a curator, which is someone who's responsible for the plants in a collection. Educators, a lot of educators have biology backgrounds, and then they layer on the education part, and then they become educators. And actually that's not restricted to just botanical gardens, but plenty of places that interpret, including parks and science world and those kind of things. Conservation biologists, technicians, even directors of some botanical gardens have that biology background, and then outreach staff as well. Horticulture approach, sometimes actually the blend of science and horticulture, so getting the biology degree and getting the practical training in horticulture. So horticulture is kind of how you actually care and maintain and grow plants. It's the hands-on sort of stuff. If you can combine the horticulture with a biology degree, the degree in botany, then you become very valuable to places like the Botanical Garden. We look for people who have both that academic and practical training for people who are going to become our curators and horticulturists. They instantly get a step up when it comes to interviews and jobs if they have both of those. Horticulturists also become propagation specialists. They become educators, conservation horticulturists. There's a lot of, if you're trying to preserve a rare plant species, there's a lot of horticulture, especially if you're doing conservation outside of the area where it grows natively, like in a botanical garden. There's a lot of horticulture in terms of propagating it and generating new plants or learning how it to successfully make it grow from seed and that kind of thing. So horticulture is an approach for that. Admin staff at botanical gardens, sometimes they have biology backgrounds. It's always helpful for anybody who's an administrator at places like where I work to have that nature background, because then they get the institution. They understand what it's all about. And there's other higher education type careers that sometimes find jobs in botanical gardens. Specialists like historians, botanical librarians, photographers, artists in residences, ethicists even. And just a little bit of a blurb about UBC Botanical Garden for you as students. For you, it can be a place of respite, so come and visit. Unfortunately, you're not UBC students, so you don't get to get in for free, although you do in the wintertime. You do get discounted rates. It's a place where you can come and think. We do have volunteering opportunities. We occasionally have job opportunities for students. If you have work, an assignment that you have to do for some of your coursework here, and you have to find somebody in the community that to help you with that assignment, or you have to find a volunteer opportunity as part of your coursework, come and actually usually people come and speak with me about that. That's kind of another one of my jobs, is to help students find tasks that they can do at the Botanical Garden that benefits both them and the garden. And then graduate research as well. And that is my talk on synchronicity. So,
Any questions?
Yes, absolutely. Any questions?
How many species do you have in the garden?
How many species do we have in the Botanical Garden? We have about 8,000 accessions. And an accession can be more. That can be more than one. An accession can mean more than one species. So that would probably mean we have about 5,000, 5,500 different species. We would actually say different taxa, because we actually have things that are cultivars, and we don't consider cultivar species, but about 5,500 different kinds of plants. Yes?
Are there some unique plant varieties that you guys have come up with? Because sometimes when I like plants and I buy quite a few of them, sometimes I see that they've come from the UBC.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure whether they were just propagated there or
Right.
they were kind of invented there. So
Right. Yes. So during the 1980s, when there was a bit of a budget crunch, the Botanical Garden took the approach of trying to develop new plants for industry and put plant patents on them and market them. And we don't do that too much nowadays, although if you see that rhododendron picture, that's something that's in my back of my head for that one. But yes, so there is kind of about 24 different plants that the Botanical Garden has introduced into the trade. Some of them are very successful, like Ribes sanguineum, white icicle, which is a white flowered gooseberry, which will be out. You see a lot of these plants at SkyTrain stations. Actually, the plantings around SkyTrain stations, especially the Expo line, because the Expo line was put in 1986. That was kind of the heyday of that plant introduction scheme. So if you look around those SkyTrain stations, often a lot of those plantings were plants that were introduced into cultivation by the Botanical Garden. So a lot of those were developed or were selected by Botanical Garden staff.
it's not a major source of revenue.
Not anymore, no. Not too much. The plan didn't really come to fruition of being a sustainable source of revenue. There's just a lot of work involved with producing that much for the trade. Maybe a different way of approaching it would work, but we don't really have an interest in that right now. Yes?
A comment and a question. I've attended an awful lot of these career talks over the last few years, and I find that no one who's ever spoken here has had a direct path from what they decided to major into to a career. There was always a bunch of detours, so it was very good to hear of yours there. I think that that's helpful when we're walking through our careers. The other thing I wanted to ask is, you were talking about student volunteers. Do you ever take co-op students?
Yes, we have in the past taken co-op students, but unfortunately it usually requires us to have some money on hand for that. And that's usually, right now that's a bit of an issue. We actually have, through the 1990s and through much of the 2000s, we had an endowment fund essentially for students. But during that 2008-2009 crash, and the university is requiring us to build up that fund before we can take any interest from it again. So essentially our co-op type stuff for students right now is gone, unfortunately, unless we can find grants. But I mean, we'd certainly be happy and willing to, but it would have to be through grant funding. Yeah. Hi.
Do you accept volunteers outside of UBC students?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. So we have volunteers for events. So that's kind of a very short-term commitment, like our Apple Festival, which is our really our number one community event during the year. And that's kind of a short time commitment. And then we also have longer time commitments doing small research projects or work in the library or sometimes some of the documentation stuff with plants. So we do have those opportunities as well. Longer term commitments though. But yes, if you like, my contact email is on the bottom. Yes.
Your multiple experiences about which Gerda referenced are certainly, I guess, common for many professionals today, that you step over here for a little while and then move over here before you finally find your place.
Mm-hmm.
Given your experiences, what advice would you impart to students who are about to embark on their career, and what advice would you impart about managing their careers?
Okay, so yeah, that's not a, yeah, well, do I have another hour? So what advice would I give to students about to embark on their career? I would say don't give up, especially if you're really passionate about something. I would say try to find a career that takes both your education and your passion and put them together, because people will recognize passion. And if you're a passionate person, if you're passionate about something, they usually will want to try to help you meet your goals. I would say that another thing about to embark is don't think that learning ends with your degree, that you have to keep on learning, especially these days. Nowadays, I think work is more about a constant learn, work cycle. My wife is going through additional education right now. It's not really going to give her too much more in terms of what she's doing, but it's a supplement to what she's currently doing. And I'd like to do the same, go back and learn a little bit more, and then that will open up a few more opportunities for me. While people, once they've reached their career and how to sustain it, I would say, I guess, be professional. I mean, that's kind of a big thing. I mean, I've been at the garden for 13 years, and frankly, working at the university is, it's very accommodating in terms of, I mean, I don't have to show up at 8:30 on the dot, and I don't have to leave at 4:30 on the dot. There's a lot of personal sort of things that you can do at university. You kind of follow personal paths a little bit, personal interests, especially if you blend them in with your work. But I think some of the things that have kept me there for so long, you know, I developed good relationships with my coworkers, generally friendly. Being able to communicate with others is a huge thing. I mean, if you're able to learn from others and to talk with others, that goes a long way to sustaining a job. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's thank Daniel Mosquin for a very